All right, great. Welcome to the Graduate School panel. My name is Karen Lewis. I'm the Assistant Director for the Advising Office, and I'll be moderating today. To get us started, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and discuss their undergraduate and graduate journey and what led them to their current position. As I said, some of you have asked questions in advance, but if you have additional questions you would like to ask the panelists, please post them in the chat and I will ask them as the hour goes on. All right. So again, we'd just like to talk a little bit about your education and how it is that you came to your position at the University of Maryland, and we'll start with Lindsay. You're still muted.
Hi, everyone. Oh, can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Everyone can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Bernal, and I coordinate the creative writing program here at Maryland. Let's think about my journey. So I did my undergrad at the University of Virginia, and I did my MFA here at the University of Maryland. As a senior, I started taking creative writing courses, so I was really kind of not prepared immediately, like upon graduating from UVA, to apply to MFA programs. So I took a bit of time, 3 years between graduating from UVA and getting into graduate school. I actually did apply. I did apply the first time, and I didn't apply to enough schools. And I really couldn't afford to go to a program without funding. So that first time applying was a real learning experience for me, because I knew I had to widen the net. And I had to work on my writing sample, and I got into a program, but I just couldn't afford to go to it. So I continued working. I continued to be in touch with my teachers that I'd had at the University of Virginia, and I also kept taking workshops. I was living in New York, and there were opportunities to take workshops with writers living in New York, and I did that, and I built my community, and I just kept persisting. And the second time I applied to MFA programs, I applied to 11 places, and I got into 3. And Maryland was one of them. And I got into the University of Montana as well. And I was scared to go that far from New York to Missoula. So I chose Maryland. I didn't visit. I read the books by our faculty, and I read the books by the faculty at the other schools. And I felt like Maryland was the right place for me. And I also had the opportunity to get in touch with alumni from the program. I mean, that's how Maryland made it onto my list, really. It was pretty accidental. I went to a book launch in New York, and the guy whose book was coming out had been an alum of Maryland, this guy, James Hoke, and he said, go to Maryland. Like, apply to Maryland if you're applying to MFA programs. And that's really how that's how I ended up applying to Maryland. That's a lot.
No, that was great. That's really helpful information. Josh, we'll have you go next.
Hi, sure. So I guess I've been a little bit of a professional English major my whole adult life. I studied literature in college and started writing poetry there. And, you know, as one find a calling, it just happens. And I just kept pursuing it. I wasn't really worried about professional aspects of anything. I just found something that I loved, and that's what made sense to me. So I just kept on that path. I took time out between finishing my undergraduate degree in English and then applying to graduate school. I wasn't sure graduate school was really for me, but I knew that I wanted to work with a particular poet, and so I applied to a master's program out at Berkeley where this poet taught, with the idea that regardless of whether I really was interested in completing a degree successfully, by getting into a program and enrolling in it, I would have this kind of formalized opportunity to work with this poet. And so that's what I did. I got an MA in a couple of years in English and American literature, and then I took some time off between that program, which I did finish, and starting a doctoral program, which I also didn't know if I wanted to do, but I knew that if I got into the doctoral program at Berkeley, that I'd be able to continue this relationship in a formalized way with this poet and kind of continue an apprenticeship with him. And so I took some time off before I did that. I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. I dug holes for a living. I worked in a grocery store. I worked as an office temp. I just did jobs and wrote. And then I started a doctoral program at Berkeley, and I was not in a rush because there weren't any jobs, so I took my time. And you're allowed 10 years at Berkeley, or you were at that, and it took me that long to finish. If they had allowed 12 years, it would have taken me 12 years. If it had allowed 15 years, it would have taken me 15. But eventually I finished, and along the way, I had written a book of poems, and that book was published, and I had all along, in any case, decided that I wasn't going to try to find a job as a scholar because I wasn't particularly good at that, but I could teach the things that I really loved to do. And so I held out and ended up at Maryland.
Excellent. GerShun? You're still muted. You're still muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Maybe one day I'll actually figure out the mute button, but I guess not today. I will start by saying I was a first generation college student. So I went to college and I didn't have a lot of, besides kind of models of hard work, I didn't have models of how to get through even an undergraduate program. And when I was in undergrad, went to a small liberal arts school, my primary goal was to graduate and become a high school English teacher, because I knew I liked reading and I liked writing. And that just seemed, that's something that I could imagine doing. It was in kind of the realm of possibility for me because I'd gone to high school and I'd seen that as an option. And it was in undergrad that one of my faculty mentors suggested I consider going to graduate school, which I had never actually considered at all as an actual option for something that could use my skill set. So it's only because of my advisor that I considered going to graduate school. And when I got to graduate school, I spent most of the time I was there being uncertain if I really belonged and if I could do it. Up until I graduated, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to finish the program, or, we always have those doubts about whether I could do it. And after I graduated, what did I want to say? I'll leap forward so I don't take too long. I moved to Maryland a few years ago from a different institution. And there I have been doing some admin work, which is something what I do now, but also had gotten an opportunity to really create a bunch of courses in my field, which is African American literature. And part of what has driven me throughout my career, up through my time here, is trying to create the kinds of educational opportunities that I didn't get to have myself when I was an undergrad, having gone to a small school. So for instance, my field is African-American literature. I never had an African-American literature course in undergrad. It wasn't in a curriculum. And so I actually, this doesn't make sense to most people, I went to grad school to learn about the field I study, as opposed to having a kind of a basis understanding of it. I didn't learn the field at all until I was in graduate school. So I've always felt behind, actually, in terms of understanding my field. So part of what I've been trying to do, and the jobs I've had in my time here in Maryland, is trying to help create intellectual spaces around this field that I wanted to learn about when I was an undergrad. I think I'll stop there if that's okay. I don't want to take up too much time.
That's great. Jason? You're muted too. There you go.
Hi, everyone. So I started my undergraduate career knowing that I wanted to be an English professor. And I actually sat down with my undergraduate advisor. I was at Princeton. And I sat down with her my first semester of college, and I told her I wanted to go to graduate school and be an English professor. And she flat out laughed at me. It was like a laugh out loud, spit across the desk kind of laugh. But I think that was really helpful to me to frame what was going forward as something that wasn't inevitable, something that was going to be a real challenge. And so I just asked her, well, I recognize this is not inevitable, but what should I do that would give me the best likelihood of being able to succeed in this thing that I'd really like to do? And she gave me a pretty long list of things that included learning multiple languages and hosting a conference at the university before I graduated. And I mean, it was kind of an absurd list, but I did those things because I was dead set on doing this thing. So I went to graduate school at Rutgers, which was just a little ways up the road from Princeton. And I focused on 19th century British literature, which is still largely my focus. I finished in 7 years, and in the middle of that adopted an infant child. So had the experience of being the primary caregiver of an infant boy while writing a dissertation, which is not necessarily something I recommend, but it turned out to work just fine for me. And when I arrived at Maryland, I was hired as an assistant English professor, but I was also affiliate faculty with what was then called the program in LGBT studies, and which has now been moved into the women's studies department. And I'll just say that subsequent to finishing my doctoral work, my way of thinking about British literature I no longer really think about British literature. I think about 19th century or literature in English in the 19th century. And most of my work focuses on other spaces around the globe. So Australia, New Zealand, increasingly places in South America. So I'll pause there for now.
Thank you. Alannah?
Hi, my name is Alannah Hensley. I'm in my third and final year in the MFA program here for poetry. I knew I wanted to go to grad school because I really wanted to improve as a poet, and I really didn't even feel like I was writing, poems when I was in my undergrad. I was getting a degree in English, but it was a general degree, so I took a lot of creative writing classes, but it was very lit focused. The summer before my senior year, I got my list of programs together. I knew I wanted to do a full residency program and that it needed to be fully funded because I didn't have like savings or anything that I could use, and I didn't want to go into debt for the MFA. So I used the Poets and Writers database, which is a great resource that you can filter by funding, by location, by residency status. And I got together a list of 14 schools with staggered deadlines because MFA applications start being due early November, and there are people who take applications well into April. And I ended up applying to 10 of them. I got into 3 and got waitlisted at 2. Maryland, I didn't know anything about Maryland when I applied. They were listed in the Poets and Writers database as being fully funded, but there wasn't. I just didn't track down much information, and I almost missed this application deadline. I remember I submitted it at like 10:59 the night it was due, and it was one of the first schools I heard back from. It had a really fast turnaround, and part of the reason I picked it was because the funding here is incredible, but also when they accepted me, I felt very wanted. I got like really good communication from the professors. They continued to reach out to me. They informed me about the program. That's really important too, especially with an MFA, because that lets you know what kind of program you're going into. Like Sarah Lawrence sent me a very general, "You've been admitted, we have no funding" email. Portland State was a little bit better, but they were pretty upfront about this is competitive funding and it's hard to get a GA ship and Portland is expensive. And so those are some things to consider also, but that was the real pull for me with Maryland was I really liked the faculty and they really made me feel like they wanted me to be here and that they really liked my work.
Great information. All right, Hilary.
Hi, my name's Hilary Regline. I am in my 7th and final year of my PhD at Maryland. I study 19th century American literature. And I guess, okay, so my journey here was, I did my BA in literature at Texas A&M University. I'm originally from Texas. I'm also the first person in my family to ever leave the state of Texas. And I did my undergraduate degree in English literature and I minored in history. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was in undergrad, but I have always been attracted to I always have felt compelled when I think about how hard it is to write a book, and I think about how many people over the course of centuries have written books. I feel compelled and somewhat responsible to read what they wrote. And so I started studying history and English, and I had a professor of 19th century American literature at Texas A&M who saw potential in me and started talking to me about thinking about graduate school. And yeah, I guess junior year I decided, well, I don't know if I want to be an English professor, but I do feel like I feel responsible to keep reading if I can. And I had thought if I can get funded to read and write about 19th century American literature, then like I feel like I have like tricked the world or something, like I have gamed the system. I don't necessarily feel that way now at the end of my program, but that was sort of the like impetus for me applying to grad school. And now, yeah, so I applied, I started like working on application materials my junior year, and then I applied to 10 programs, all BA direct programs. I got into 2 and I was waitlisted at 1 and eventually was accepted to that 3rd program. And then I came to University of Maryland mostly because I was advised to go here. My previous advisor at Texas A&M was like saying, you know, like the job market is really tough. If you are serious about becoming a scholar, then University of Maryland is the most competitive program and where things are happening, so you should go there. And I said, okay. I wanted to move out of Texas anyway, so I ended up here, and I'm still in 19th century American literature, though I have had many shifts in my research over the last 7 years. And now I am finishing my dissertation. I am working on career prep for next year, and I am also an advisor in the undergraduate English office. So I don't know, maybe I will meet some of you through that capacity.
Thank you, everybody. Again, students, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them into the chat. I'm going to start with the questions that were sent in advance. The first question for the panel is, would you advise applying to graduate school right after finishing undergrad or taking time off to gain work experience first? Would anybody like to address that? Jason, go ahead.
And I regularly tell students that that was a mistake. And it's not that things went horribly wrong. It's just that in retrospect, that is a moment in one's life where so many possibilities exist, right? And as you move forward through your life, the kind of freedom that you could have right after graduation becomes increasingly more difficult to lay hold of. So I look back at that one, imagining it might have been a year, maybe two, where I could have done a lot of traveling, I could have taught anywhere around the world, etc. Or I could have done volunteer work. Those are meaningful things that I would have liked to have done, that once I had finished graduate school and had a child, but more to the point was kind of on a career path, that was not a possibility for me. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you will do your, you will do your best academic work in your last year at the university. And ideally you want to have that work to share as your writing sample when you apply to a graduate program. So it's also strategic for getting into the program you want to get into if you postpone a little bit.
For those, oh, go ahead, GerShun.
I just wanted to agree with Jason really quickly, but because I went straight through, and obviously it worked out, nothing wrong with it, but I also look back and kind of wish I'd had a little time. And I always advise students to at least consider taking a year off for the exact reasons Jason mentioned, but also because it's really, really hard to apply to grad school your fall of your senior year. Like you're already incredibly busy. Adding that on top of it, most deadlines are due at the end of the semester when finals are, it's just exhausting. And there's nothing, I mean, it's great to get in there and get started, but I don't think you lose out having a little bit more time to kind of polish off the materials and just take a little time to rest away from studying. So I always encourage students to consider it. For many, it might not be a good situation. It might be best to go straight through, but I think it should be in your big kind of puzzle of life where you're trying to place things. That should be in that puzzle too, figuring out if that's going to make sense or if you should take it out.
I was going to just a follow-up for those of you that actually review applications on the panel, because several of you do, is it's that a factor at all when you notice someone has taken some time off versus applying straight away?
No.
It's not a factor,
come up.
but we notice.
And I'll say that a lot of times what I notice is that applicants who have taken time off are able to write statements of purpose that are more meaningful. So, I remember in particular one student writing from Syria. This was before the civil war there, but she said, I'm here teaching English, and here's what I've learned about 19th century literature while I've been teaching it in Syria. And, wow, that's something that got my attention, right? And it's not something that any undergraduate would likely be able to write from home.
I just have one thing to add too about my experience as a student. Like my cohort was kind of mixed between students who had taken time off and students who came directly from undergrad. And I would say the students who came directly from undergrad were kind of like done with the program earlier. They were kind of like, I just want to be out of school. Like I want to finish the program definitely in 2 years. I want to start my life outside of academia. And I was really the opposite. Like I mean, as evidenced by my whole path, like I never left. I was like, I'm going to stay at Maryland forever, because as I didn't really have the choice to apply to an MFA program, as I said, because I just didn't think my work was strong enough. And I taught in the New York City public schools upon graduating, and then I like quit after a year, and then I did a random array of like part-time terrible jobs. And I feel like by the time I applied to MFAs, I was so ready to be back in school, and I think that was really helpful to me, to be sort of excited about learning, and I just needed to get out of that New York life I was living.
Makes sense. All right. The next question we have is it important to have a research concentration / prospective thesis topic already in mind before starting a program?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a good question to ask, in part because when on the literature side, when we read applications for a program, we do kind of want to have a sense of kind of what your interests are and what path you're going to take, because part of what we do in admissions is trying to make sure we pick students for whom we're a good fit. Like, we don't want to bring someone that we can't serve. We don't have anyone in that area at all. So it does matter to have a sense, even if you don't know exactly, but you do need to have a sense of kind of what your interests are, what your area might be. And if you have a rough idea about what your project might be on, it's helpful to talk about it. But you should know that in no way are you wedded to that project. You don't have to, if you kind of outline one, we're not going to expect you to have to come here and do it. Like, so don't feel like you should do it. But it is helpful for us to understand how you see your kind of intellectual trajectory. And for most of you, it'll be based on the kind of work you did in undergrad. So the papers that you enjoyed the most, the class you enjoyed the most, arguably might be the ones that help you understand kind of the work you want to do, at least for the first part of your graduate experience. So I do think it's important to be able to kind of outline the direction you want to go in, the big field or historical period. And if you can talk about, if you don't want to commit to a project, you can talk about, for example, a senior thesis you did or a big paper you wrote for a class, and how that could be the beginning of, or the first step toward something you might do in graduate school.
I mean, it is a factor too in researching institutions you wish to apply to, correct? To have some idea of what you want to study, and are there faculty there that study that as well? All right, great. Okay, this one's about MFA programs. Would an MFA program be a worthwhile pursuit for writers who are interested in genre fiction rather than literary writing?
Yes. Absolutely. Also, make sure that you find an MFA program that doesn't separate genre fiction from literary writing. So basically, like, this divide, we're kind of coming out of it, but absolutely, you should apply to an MFA program that respects your writing and takes it and holds it in the same light as all the other writing. And we have some great, if you want to call it speculative fiction writers or genre fiction writers in this program. And we love their work just as much as the literary fiction people. So yes, absolutely, you should.
Josh?
It's an interesting question. And as Alannah suggests, it's like a false binary. And one of the things that we all, you could say, appreciate is the way that writers draw from genres as they're kind of formulaically established over time, and then bend them in different ways. And that's something that distinguishes writing. And so it would be a mistake to think in those kind of rigid classifications. The best thing to do is to ask that question of the faculty at the programs that you're interested in applying to, and look carefully at their answers.
Great. Another MFA question. In addition to taking creative writing courses as an undergraduate, what other types of experience would you recommend the prospective MFA student gain before they apply?
I'd love to hear from Alannah and Lindsay on this one.
I'm sorry, I lost the connection a little bit there. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. In addition to taking creative writing courses as an undergraduate, what other types of experience would you recommend that a prospective MFA student gain prior to applying?
I had literally none besides just taking classes. I had nothing. I had met like 3 poets. They aren't poets you would know. They're just people who worked at my university that wrote and maybe published sometimes. We did some like writer's circle type activities. We didn't have readings. No one came to our campus. I had not been to like a reading. I was in the middle of nowhere. I had, I guess what probably informed my words, I had life experience in the sense that like I lived in a really crazy place and there was like stuff happening all the time. I was in the rural South and I was just really into the language and crazy stuff that's going on. So I guess maybe I would say spend some time ruminating on the experience you already have. Mm-hmm. Look at what's already happened to you, look at what you've already done, because with writing, so much of it is about living. Think about that instead of thinking, I've got to like chase this summer workshop or go to a conference, or because I felt that way when I was an undergrad, and that stuff didn't really do anything for my writing. But turning around and looking and being like, maybe I actually do want to write about where I live, and the things that I actually know about, and not the other stuff. That's what really did the most for me, especially when writing the sample, because that really came through for me in my thesis in undergrad.
I totally endorse that answer. That's great.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add to that answer. That was great, Alannah. I mean, it's like, and Josh can speak to this, but I mean, what the faculty are interested in when they're looking at the applications or like the writing sample. So like, yes, they look at the full application, but like they're looking at your poems and the novel excerpt or short stories that you're submitting. So I think that, you know,
we would have admitted Emily Dickinson. I feel sure of it, and she didn't go anywhere. It doesn't really matter. It really does. It's really about what you make of whatever experience you are experiencing, wherever you are, whatever you're paying attention to, the quality of that attention, in the way that you get that in language and form. That's what makes a writer.
We have one more MFA question, slightly related. Is there a recommended number of years of experience in creative writing, meaning publishing your work, taking classes, that a prospective student should have before they apply?
No.
Okay, great, short and sweet.
I had no publications, and to this date still have no publications.
I had no publications either, and I didn't have a lot of workshop experience in an academic setting. Like I just didn't, because I didn't take workshop as an undergrad until the very end.
Just to really reemphasize, because it's an important question. The thing that really matters in the application is the sample, is the writing, and then everything else creates a context for understanding what that writing is and where it comes from.
So as I say next, oh, go ahead, Jason.
I could just jump in. One maybe slight difference between applying to an MFA and an MA or PhD program is that, yes, the writing sample does matter for those applications, but equally important, and sometimes maybe more so, is the statement of purpose, because that is the first thing a committee will look at. And if the statement of purpose is not compelling, then some committee members may not go on to read the writing sample. So I just really encourage anyone applying to an MA or PhD program that the statement of purpose is not something to be taken care of in a sitting or two. It's something to be developed over weeks of deep thinking, sharing that document, getting feedback, revising. It's a really important moment in the application process.
Great.
I
Rudy,
love,
go ahead.
I just want to say, I love that answer because it's the exact opposite for the MFA. If we're not interested in the sample, we're not going to read the statement. The sample actually leads us to the statement. But to put like a finer point on what Jason is saying, that just occurs to me, one of the things that's so important about this statement, that's even separate from the writing sample, even for the MFA, is that that's a moment when you are in full control of how you represent yourself. But one of the only moments.
We actually do have an event coming up shortly on writing a good personal statement, which will also be recorded for students to review. But my next question was actually going to be to ask GerShun if you could talk a little bit more about the personal statement and what you are looking for in it.
Okay, yeah, and I'm happy to do it, and I can just build on what Jason and Josh were saying. So I don't know if there is an ideal personal statement, but there are certain things you should try to do in it, to repeat some things that have been said. I think you want to kind of explain what your interests are and how you got to that point. So the classes you've taken that have informed your ideas, your sense of your future. You also want to be able to explain in that. So kind of identify what your interests are, but you also want to be able to explain why whatever school you're applying to is a good fit for you, why it makes sense that you're applying to that school. So I always encourage students in a personal statement, after you talk about your intellectual trajectory, your goals, your professional goals, you also talk about why said school is a good fit. So why you want to work with a particular faculty member that work there, or your particular programs they have or symposia. You want to make sure that you're trying to, as Josh says, create a narrative about yourself that why it would make sense for that school to pick you. All right. So as much as we want to pick someone who are a good fit, part of what you're doing in that personal statement is explain to us why you are the perfect candidate for our program, why we need you here, given all the pieces we have together. So in other words, I think part of the reason that Jason was saying it takes some time to write it is because you need to kind of come up with this sense of yourself, but you also should be doing a little bit of research about these institutions to figure out why they are a good fit for you. So I think there are a couple things you have to do in the statement that involve kind of declaring your interests, kind of what your professional goals are, what areas you're interested in, and why, let's say, Maryland is the place for you to achieve those goals. I think making those kinds of moves can help to create a very solid statement. But going back for just a moment to what Jason was saying, I also think this is the moment when you should really reach out to faculty mentors that you like and respect and know your work, and have them read a draft of it. I think there's not strange to get a request to ask by one of my students to read the draft of their personal statement. I think you really want that to happen. As much as maybe they've read your writing sample, that's great, but they should also read just a draft of your personal statement, because it is kind of a form, and you want to understand how to make the right kinds of moves. And the best way to do it is to kind of try it out and get some feedback to make sure it's making sense. And I will also say that I am always willing to read anyone's draft of personal statements. I read them all the time. So even if you haven't had me in a class and you're considering applying to an MA or a PhD program, feel free to email me and I will absolutely read it. Because again, the best way to have a strong one, going back to Jason's point, is to have someone read it and give you the feedback you need to make sure you're hitting the right notes.
If I could just jump in, and I agree with everything that GerShun just said, and I'd just add that there are certain things you want to avoid, and that would be falling into patterns of writing that are predictable and generic. And that would include, for example, saying, I love books. I love reading. I've always loved reading, and I just really want to do this for the rest of my life. Like, well, of course you do, right? So do I. I think everyone in this meeting, that's like that should be a given. And when you're talking about something that is a given, it means that it's not something to be writing about as something that's particular to you in your statement. So of course show enthusiasm, but channel that enthusiasm through particulars that will make you stand out as distinct. So what what I'm looking for when I read these statements are qualities that bring a real thinking, feeling human being to life, and rather than a type of person, which would be the person who loves to read and talk about books and write about them.
For GerShun and Josh, I'm going to ask a question students ask of me all the time. It's a source of great anxiety. GRE scores. How do they factor into the process?
So that one's really easy on the lit side. Of course, it depends on the schools you apply to. We're at the point now in time when some programs require them, some don't. It's actually, as you all probably know, it really depends on the program, whether you have to take either the GRE lit exam or even the GRE general exam. And currently our program does require the GRE, but that is not a deciding factor for admission. That's what I'll say. I think we are much more interested, because we try to use a holistic admissions process. We're much more interested in trying to find people who are hardworking, committed, and whose interests that we think we can help to cultivate. So I'll say this. My short answer to the question is, do not let the GRE kind of freak you out, nor should you let it decide whether or not you're applying to graduate school. It is not a deciding factor in our decision-making about students we admit. We admit students who have basically perfect GRE scores. We admit students who have much lower GRE scores, but for us, that is not how, we do not use that as that measure to decide whether or not a student is worthy.
And no one's going to look at your math and logic GRE scores. So even if you got in the 5th percentile on those sections, it doesn't matter at all. I agree, the test as a whole doesn't really matter, but if anything mattered, it would be only the language section. And so don't worry about it.
All right, and I see in the chat that the MFA program does not require the GRE, so thank you for that. We do have a question in the chat. When applying directly to a PhD program, are there ways to set an application apart? And what about an application would make a reader choose that person over someone who already has a master's degree?
Oh, that's a very that's a good question. That's a really good question. I had to think about it for a second. So we do admit students directly from the BA and MA students. And I would say this, I think the students that we admit from the BA student, straight from BA, are students who have taken an opportunity to do some kind of advanced research project. This isn't always the case, but a lot of students who have, whether that's been for a class or kind of an independent study in undergrad, students who've kind of taken the time to kind of really work on or produce in their last year or so, a kind of a longer paper and think about what it means to do a research project. I think they tend to stand out a bit more because they talk about research projects as opposed to just writing papers in their responses. So I would say the piece of advice I would give for you, given what I just said, is I would, in your final year, as you're preparing to apply, you should really think about if you're not in honors, or if you don't have kind of a research class, you might consider picking a class that you really like and even asking to write a slightly longer paper, because most applications require a writing sample like 15, 25 pages. So make sure that you actually write something in a class approaching that, because that experience of doing a longer paper that involves research actually gives you insight on how to talk about doing research. So I'm hoping what I'm saying is making sense. I think that oftentimes that is the distinguishing experience from an MA to a BA student. An MA student probably has written a longer paper, done more research. So trying to find an opportunity to do research your last year helps you talk about and imagine a future research project, which is part of what you do in a writing sample. But Jason, I don't know if you want to add to this. I do.
I can speak so I run the English honors program, and that is one of the best opportunities that undergrads in this English department have to do that kind of long form work, whether it's on the creative side or the scholarly side. So if you are not yet a senior and you're interested in applying to graduate school, then I encourage you to apply to the English Honors Program. The deadline for the scholarly program is November 15th. Lindsay, when is the creative writing deadline? It's in mid to late October, right?
Yeah, it's October, I want to say October 15th.
I thought it was October 15th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if any of you have specific questions for the English Honors Program, I'd be happy to meet with you or to exchange emails. And Karen, could you share when is we have an honors information session coming up. What is the date of that?
It is next week. It's Tuesday the 29th at noon.
Okay. Yeah.
And we will also record that if you cannot make it. Okay, another question in the chat. Piggybacking on the previous question, what are the advantages of going straight into a PhD program as opposed to doing a master's first?
Money.
Hilary has not gotten to talk yet, so go right ahead, Hilary.
Go ahead, Hilary.
Oh yeah, so both of these previous questions I think I can speak to because I am a BA direct to PhD. As far as the first question about distinguishing yourself if you don't have a master's applying direct, I will say I was not in honors ever, but I did very well in my education. I just never pursued the honors program at Texas A&M. However, I did do what GerShun is talking about, where I had a professor who was very impressed with a paper I wrote for him in a Shakespeare, like a 300 level Shakespeare course, and encouraged me to develop it into like original research and submit it to a conference that allows undergraduate presenters. And so I was like, oh, that sounds fun. That sounds interesting. I'll do that. And I worked with him for an extra few months and eventually submitted that Shakespeare paper to the Utah Shakespeare Festival and presented on their undergraduate panel there. And so I didn't have any publications, but I had written a long paper and presented like an original argument it was actually about King Lear. And that was my writing sample. So another little point is like, even though I applied to programs knowing I wanted to do 19th century American literature, my writing sample was on King Lear. And so as a BA direct, you have a little bit more, I was told that you have a little bit more leeway with what you use as your writing sample because you haven't done a master's yet. And so you're supposed to pick kind of the best thing you've written. And I was able to talk about the process that I went through for the Lear paper, even though it wasn't really my field. Advantages as far as going BA direct. Yeah, so the major advantage, at least as it was sold to me, was if you are 100% sure that scholarly research in literature is for you, then it is more economical to try to go BA direct. If you're not 100% sure that you want to dedicate 5 to 7 years of your life studying and writing a long manuscript, an MA is better for you. However, I will say that I don't know necessarily that it is more economical to do a BA direct, really, because I'm taking 7 years. So I might as well have gotten a master's somewhere else and then come here and did a PhD. And that just speaks to kind of the nature of writing a dissertation and figuring out how to create an original contribution to the institution. It just takes time. And even if you're on the BA direct line and your funding package is for 5 years, sometimes it takes longer to develop an original contribution to literary scholarship. So keep that in mind. Like, don't expect that just because you come in BA Direct that you will for sure graduate quicker or, than other people. It just depends, like research is time intensive.
Someone's also asking, are there any disadvantages to going directly into a PhD program rather than doing a master's first?
I wouldn't say there are necessarily disadvantages to doing it unless you are extremely attached to the idea of trying to finish your degree in 5 years, which I think is very difficult. One thing is that you do come in at a different life stage than a lot of your cohort. So I'm younger than everyone in my cohort. And like there were 2 of us BA Direct people, but I was the youngest in my cohort. A lot of people in my cohort have families, and I didn't. So there's a different there's sometimes a disconnect there. There's also the issue of coming in without a master's means that you haven't yet been in a graduate seminar. You haven't yet been to a graduate conference. You haven't yet written a long form article length document yet. And so all of those things are not necessarily, they're not bad, but there can be a I remember feeling very unprepared and feeling as if I were behind everybody else in my cohort because I didn't know any of the books that everybody else was talking about. I didn't know any of the scholars that they were talking about. I knew almost no literary scholarship, and everybody else knew a lot more. And so I think it can be challenging as a BA Direct to own that you belong there, especially in your first year, coming from less experience with the language and culture of scholarship.
Thank you. All right, one more question. If you want to use your bachelor's honors thesis as a writing sample, but the thesis is considerably longer than the writing sample requirements, would you recommend submitting an excerpt or using a totally different piece?
Oh, I would recommend, and I'll also happily let Jason answer this question too. I would recommend doing an excerpt from it. And it's not unusual at all for us to see writing samples that are like 20 or so pages that are from a much longer document. And it's also very usual to see, let's say you kind of cut out like the middle 20 pages or so, and you even say, this has been taken out, and people summarize what they took out. So you should feel definitely comfortable cutting out a chunk, as long as we have kind of a coherent chunk. But that happens all the time. But do you want to hit that, Jason?
I agree. And yes, so include a head note that explains what you've done, and that's all good.
Jason, you had something you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to encourage everyone who's thinking about going to graduate school there's a new book out by someone named Katina Rogers, and it's called Putting the Humanities to Work. And I think it's really important. It's a really important intervention. What she argues in this book is that what we learn in graduate programs in the humanities are much more than simply training to go into an academic job. And I think that's crucial to embrace at this moment when there really aren't that many academic jobs out there. So if you're going to go to graduate school, I think you might rightly feel some anxiety about whether you're going to get that tenure track job that maybe is the fantasy. And I think Rogers's book helps show all of the things that you also are learning and getting ready for, in addition to training to be, at a university. So for example, you know, rather than talking about the product, which is the dissertation or the particular scholarly work, we could talk more about the process and what skill sets you have that are portable to any number of other careers. So doing intense, deep research, synthesizing data, writing writing really well and persuasively, right? These are all skills that you will learn in a graduate program that you can then bring into other careers. And it's crucial at this point that you enter into a graduate program embracing that part of the work alongside what might be your goals for a university level position.
Thank you, Jason. Did get a last minute question if anyone could address this. Does anyone have experience or thoughts about graduate school abroad? Pros or cons of attending grad school abroad?
I think getting a master's abroad is often a stepping stone to a strong PhD program, so that's something to consider. At least a lot of PhD programs abroad are much shorter than those in the United States, so it's a fairly expedited process, and that has its pluses and its negatives. So if you want to do something more quickly, then that could really work for you. On the flip side, it puts you in a fairly high pressure situation of having to complete your work quickly, and often the dissertations themselves are not as robust and kind of thought through as ones produced in longer length programs here in the US. That's my experience, at least.
Thank you. All right, well.
One thing I just would add one thing, which augments what Jason said, which is at a lot of universities abroad, students do not receive the same degree and kind of mentoring that graduate students receive at American universities in those graduate programs. And that's part of, I think, of what Jason is characterizing. It's so important for your development as an intellectual.
Thank you. All right, we are out of time. There are a lot more questions I wanted to ask, but I know all of our panelists are open if you would like to contact them via email after this event. And I'm also going to just be on the lookout in Friday Fast Facts for where you can find the recording of this event. So I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone